I've never been much for getting lost on trips, especially driving at dawn on unfamiliar roads. But that night was different. I was on an isolated road, crossing the interior of a state, when, in the distance, I saw a yellowed sign indicating a pass that wasn't on my GPS. I had that feeling of, why not, you know? I was always curious, and even though I knew I should continue on the main path, I couldn't resist. The road seemed quiet, empty, and the only thing that gave me any comfort was the feeling of taking a shortcut. The first thing I noticed was that the road, although well paved, had no signs of life. No other signs, no signage, nothing. I had been away from any city for some time, but up until that point, I still saw traces of civilization, small villages, gas stations. But now, everything was too quiet. As if time had stopped there. I continued, thinking that perhaps it was an old road, which was no longer on the maps because of this. But, as I continued, the feeling of discomfort only increased. The sound of the truck's engine seemed muffled, and even the air outside the vehicle was thicker, as if the atmosphere had changed. That's when I found a fork in the road. A secondary road that seemed to lead down to a more isolated area. It was narrow, with large trees around it, almost obscuring the view of what was ahead. Curiosity got the best of me, and I ended up taking the smaller road, thinking it would just be another curve. But after a few kilometers, I realized that I was losing track of time. The road became increasingly difficult to follow. What were once open fields now turned into dense forests. There was no longer any radio signal, and the truck's headlights were reflecting strangely off the trees. As if that road was no longer for cars like mine. And then, just as I was starting to wonder if I had done the right thing, a village appeared. In fact, a street with old houses appeared, but there was no sign that the place existed. I slowed down, trying to understand what was happening. It wasn't on the map. There was absolutely nothing about it. What I knew was that it didn't make any sense. The houses were standing, but they looked like they had been abandoned for decades. There was no movement, but somehow, a feeling that someone was there, watching me. I approached slowly, trying to understand what was happening. When I passed the first house, I noticed that the window was broken, but, strangely, there was no glass lying around on the floor. This made me uncomfortable, but the worst was yet to come. As I looked out the window, I noticed that a figure was lying inside the house, with its head turned to the side, as if it were sleeping. But upon closer inspection, something didn't seem right. The body was not in a natural position. And, when the truck's headlights illuminated the interior of the house, I saw that the figure's face was facing the wall, but it seemed to be smiling in a bizarre way, as if the smile was forced, something that shouldn't exist in a human being. I continued down the road, forcing my mind to ignore what I had seen. What scared me most was the absolute silence. There was no sound, not the chirping of a bird or the rustling of trees. Just the sound of my truck, which seemed to echo even more, as if it were being swallowed by the darkness that surrounded the village. The houses were old, but they weren't like the ones you find in abandoned places, you know? They didn't look decaying or covered in moss, but frozen in time. As if no one had gone in there years ago, but also as if no one had left. The feeling of being watched became more intense. I looked around and noticed that several windows were open, but there was no one inside. The street was deserted, but I felt that the eyes of those houses were on me, as if an invisible presence was watching me. I decided to stop the truck. I didn't want to, but I needed to see what else was there. As I stepped out of the vehicle, the frigid air cut into my skin, and I smelled mold and rotting wood mixed with something more, metallic, almost like blood. I moved a little away from the truck, trying to focus on some sound, some sign of life, but all I heard was the rapid beating of my own heart. There was nothing. That's when a door opened, breaking the oppressive silence. It was a house on the corner, the furthest away from the others. I saw her, a thin, strange-looking figure emerging from inside, wearing old clothes from a time I couldn't identify. The woman looked directly at me, and instantly my body froze. Her gaze was not human. There was nothing there. It was like she was looking right through me, like I was just a shadow in a place I shouldn't be. I don't know what she wanted, but for some reason, I realized that if I stayed there any longer, something much worse would happen. I felt a shiver run through my entire body, and something inside me told me I should leave, and quickly. But before I could take a step, the sound of a door opening behind me froze me even more. I looked over my shoulder and saw a man, of medium height, wearing a truck driver's uniform, as if he was waiting for me. He was standing in the entrance of a house that, until that moment, I hadn't noticed. His eyes were cold, lifeless, and he stared at me in a way that made me feel like I was the intruder, not the other way around. He didn't say anything, but gestured for me to come closer. That figure seemed to be in no hurry, but what scared me most was the feeling that he had been there for a long time, waiting for someone like me. He knew who I was, he knew what I was doing there, and it seemed like he was inviting me to stay longer. But what I really felt was that he wasn't calling me, he was holding me. I didn't know what to do, but my head was just screaming for me to get back in the truck and get out of there. I tried to do that, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like something was holding me in that place. That man, or rather, that presence, was paralyzing me. That's when I heard a noise coming from inside the house opposite. It wasn't just any sound, it was a scratch, something heavy and dragging, as if someone was trying to get out of a tight space. The man didn't move, but his expression didn't change. I, however, quickly turned around and ran back to the truck, without looking back, with the feeling that I was not alone. Panic took over me, and when I got into the vehicle, I realized that the engine was off. There was no way it could have stopped working so quickly, but there it was, dead, as if the road had swallowed it too. With my heart in my throat, I tried to start the truck, but there was no signal. There were no lights in the streets, and the village was now completely empty. There was no one else. There was no sound. I was alone in a place that didn't exist, but where I was trapped. Panic took over me, and before I could understand what was happening, absolute silence invaded the place. The lighthouse turned on by itself, illuminating the empty street. I was back on the road. It was the same, but it wasn't. I could no longer identify the path. Something in that village had marked me in some way, as if I had crossed an invisible line and come back, but with something much darker inside me. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I never found that place again. And I don't have the courage to try to look for it. I was never one to worry about the load I carried. For me, it was always just another job, another day on the road. But that trip, number 317, was different from anything I had ever done. The client was unknown, the destination was unknown, and the pay would be good enough to make me ignore the small signs that something wasn't right. The container I was carrying was sealed, without labels, without identification. Just a heavy load, no explanations. When they told me to go directly to the delivery location, without stopping, I didn't think twice. It was work for the week, and I needed it. At first, everything seemed normal. The road was quiet, the traffic wasn't in the way, and the sound of the truck's engine was familiar. But after a few hours on the road, I started listening. A sound, low at first, almost imperceptible, as if something was moving inside the container. I thought it was the weight of the load, something that moved with the sway of the road, but the sound became clearer. It was as if something was hitting the metal walls of the container, scratching, dragging. I looked in the rearview mirror, but didn't see anything. The container was behind me, intact, motionless. But the sound didn't stop. With each passing kilometer, the sound intensified. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just my head. But then, during a refueling stop, I went to the back of the truck and placed my hand on the container. I don't know what came over me, perhaps a burst of curiosity or a strange feeling, but I felt it. The metal was cold, colder than it should be. And it was at that moment that I realized that the sounds were not coming from inside the container. They were coming from the outer walls, as if something was trying to get out from within, or, worse, as if something was trying to warn me. Panic started to take over me, but I didn't want to give in. I continued my journey, more apprehensive, but without the courage to check what was happening. The following morning, when I was driving alone, I saw something that made me accelerate the truck without meaning to. The container was shaking. It was not the normal movement of the road. It was more like a wobble, as if someone was forcing the door open from the inside. I immediately parked and got out, trying to stay calm. Taking a quick look, I noticed something that almost made me faint. The inner walls of the container were covered with symbols. I don't know how to explain it very well, but there were geometric shapes, crossed lines, and marks that I had never seen before. I stood there, watching, as if my mind couldn't process what was happening. Fear gripped me, but what scared me most was the fact that no one had told me anything about it. It was as if the container had gotten there for a reason, and I was just a pedestrian. When I finally got back into the truck, I couldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror, as if I was expecting to see something behind me, something I didn't want to see. The container was still there, quiet, but now it seemed more threatening than ever. The sound inside him was more intense, more frantic, as if something was trying to escape, or as if someone was banging against the walls, demanding to be released. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind creating stories, but the fear I felt too real to ignore. The container was no longer just any cargo. It was something, alive. As the trip progressed, I began to notice small changes. The air in the truck was heavier, as if the environment was charged with an invisible presence. The dashboard lights began to flicker, and the radio, which normally worked flawlessly, began to burst with interference. It was as if the world around me was starting to fail. I passed deserted roads and lonely mountains, but everything seemed in a state of stagnation. Time was still, the silence was almost palpable, and the road in front of me seemed to have no end. Everything felt wrong. It was at the moment I stopped to rest later that night that something really strange happened. I was on the side of the road, trying to control my anxiety, when I heard footsteps. They weren't footsteps of people, but the sound of something heavier, more dragging. I went to the back of the truck and, when I opened the container door, a strange, damp smell filled the air. As if something dead was there, or something that had been left to rot for a long time. The sound inside the container suddenly stopped, and I didn't know if that made me calmer or more paranoid. I looked at the symbols on the walls and then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. They were changing, as if they were alive, as if they were rearranging themselves before my eyes. I wanted to go back to the truck, close everything up and forget about this damn load, but an impulse made me look inside the container one last time. The moment I looked closer, I saw a shadow moving on the walls, a strange, indistinct figure. It was as if something was watching. I don't know how to describe the feeling, but it was like the container was closing around me, like the air was being sucked in, and I was trapped there with something that wasn't human. It was at that moment that I felt a real presence, something watching me, something that wanted to stop me from moving forward. That feeling of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it has only increased. I got back into the truck, trying to convince myself that this was all just a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. But things were starting to get worse. The banging sound from the container grew louder, more insistent, as if someone inside was becoming desperate. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made me almost lose my bearings. A figure, a human shadow, was moving behind the truck. It wasn't possible. I knew I was alone on the road, but somehow, she was there. I tried to speed up, but no matter how hard I tried, the road never seemed to end. Desperate, I stopped the truck again. Fear consumed me, and the idea of continuing the journey seemed increasingly unbearable. When I got down, the marks on the container were deeper, almost as if the metal was being corroded from the inside out. I tried to take a step towards the container, but something stopped me. The air around was freezing, and I felt a growing pressure, as if something was pushing me away. It was then that I heard a voice, faint but clear, coming from inside the container. I don't know how to explain it, but the voice wasn't human. It was like a whisper, a low, strange melody that seemed to pull me into the metal itself. I ran back to the truck, almost tripping over my own feet. All I wanted was to get out of there, but something was holding me back. Something inside the container was calling me. I didn't know what else to do, whether I should try to open that door, or whether I should run away and leave that damn container behind. But before I could make a decision, something on the truck's dashboard lit up, as if an unknown energy had taken over the vehicle. The engine started on its own, and before I could react, the truck started to move on its own, as if guided by an invisible force. The road in front of me was deserted, but it no longer felt real. It was as if the world was distorting. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was consuming me, but when I opened them again, the truck was stopping, alone, in the middle of a completely different road. I didn't know where I was. I didn't recognize anything around me. The container was quiet, but the sound inside it was no longer there. The feeling of being watched, of having something watching closely, disappeared. And suddenly the container seemed more like ordinary, harmless cargo. I got out of the truck, looked around, but there was nothing. No houses, no cities, no signs of life. Just emptiness. And that's how it all stopped, without explanation, as if reality had folded in and swallowed me, and I had been left behind. I never knew what happened to that damn container again. This story happened about 4 years ago, and to this day I avoid talking about it. It's not just because it seems absurd, it's because to this day, when I hit the road in the early hours of the morning, I get those butterflies in my stomach, as if it could happen again. It was a normal day, at least it was supposed to be. I left home around 5 a.m., with the mission of making an interstate delivery. The sun hadn't even risen properly yet, just that orange glow deep in the sky. I was well rested, quiet road, little movement, everything was perfect. Until I got on that damn highway. She was different, but nothing that caught much attention at first. It seemed like just another one of those lesser-known stretches, a little poorly signposted. But I remember well the moment I started to think it was strange. After about 20-30 minutes, I realized that I no longer saw any cars coming in the opposite direction or overtaking them. No posts, no signs, no cloverleaf. Just the asphalt that was too smooth, the side surrounded by dry vegetation and the sky slowly lightening. The first feeling was of isolation. But then, it turned into anguish. The road seemed to repeat itself, as if I were driving in circles, but without making any turns. That's when I noticed something really bizarre. I passed a broken branch on the side of the road. I remember it because it had a crooked shape, it looked like a hand, and after a while, I passed it again. And once again. I was sure I was going in a straight line, the speedometer showed the same speed, nothing indicated that I was going back or that I had made a U-turn. I started counting the kilometers. Every time I thought I was going to leave there, that I was going to cross a small town or an entrance, everything happened again. And it wasn't tiredness. I was lucid. completely awake. But it seemed like the road was folding in on itself. I stopped the truck. I took a deep breath. The radio didn't pick up anything anymore. I tried calling my contact at the shipping company, but there was no signal on my cell phone. It was as if I were in the middle of a void, as if the road didn't exist anywhere. I decided to do one simple thing. I turned around. Literally. I turned the truck around and started back. But, after a few minutes, guess what I saw? The same branch. In the same place. The road, even when I walked in the opposite direction, returned me to the same point. I started to break out in a cold sweat. Something was very wrong. I wasn't just lost, I was trapped. I kept trying every possible alternative. I did more than an hour of maneuvers, straights, curves, slowdowns. I even tried to leave the asphalt and follow a stretch of dirt that seemed improvised nearby. But it was useless. Every time I returned to the asphalt, no matter the entry point, I ended up in the same section again. The same branch, the same strange sky, the same landscape repeated to the point of absurdity. I started to wonder if I had fallen asleep at the wheel, if this was some kind of lucid dream or something worse. But the smell of diesel, the stifling heat inside the cabin, even the discomfort in my spine from driving so much, everything said it was real. After a while, the sky became clearer, but the sun did not rise. It was as if the dawn had stopped, frozen in that pale orange light that never truly became day. This started to affect me in a strange way. I had the impression that I had been there much longer than my watch said. The mind started to get confused. I found myself talking to myself, tapping on the steering wheel, laughing at nothing, and then crying. It was like something was playing with me, testing me, pulling me into a kind of desperation I had never felt before. That was when, for the first time, I saw something else on the road. Not a car, not a person. A type of shadow. Something standing far away, in the middle of the track, motionless. At the time, I accelerated. I wanted to get closer, understand what it was. But the more I accelerated, the more the figure seemed to move away. I didn't run. He just stayed away. It always seemed to be the same distance from me. When I realized this, something inside me twisted. It was as if that thing was controlling everything, as if it was fully aware of where I was, and was keeping me exactly where it wanted. I tried to brake, but the pedal felt strange, too soft. I tried to turn off the engine, and nothing happened. The truck continued forward, as if it had a mind of its own. I started screaming, desperate, and hit the steering wheel hard, almost in an outburst. But nothing made any difference. I was being guided by some force that didn't make sense. I looked through the windshield again. The shadow was gone. In its place, far away, something that looked like a sign appeared. A silly hope rose in me. But when I got close, I realized, it was just a white sign, with nothing written on it. Empty, as if mocking my expectations. I started laughing. A nervous, uncontrolled laugh. This was no longer a trip, it was a looping nightmare. The road never ended, time never passed, and each attempt to escape only brought me back to the same place, like a mouse trapped in a maze that rebuilds itself. The thought of abandoning the truck crossed my mind more than once, but when I tried to open the door, it was locked. Not by key, but by something beyond logic. As if the truck itself had merged into that crooked reality. I started to wonder if anyone had been through this before. If there were other truck drivers trapped on invisible routes, disappeared in a way that no one would ever discover. Time passed in a strange way. I no longer knew if it was morning, afternoon, or night. Everything was stuck in that same limbo. And that's when things started to change, but not for the better. The truck's radio turned on by itself. A loud hiss filled the cabin and, in the middle of it, voices. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but there were several of them, whispering at the same time, as if they were inside my head. I covered my ears, but they continued. And somehow I knew they were talking about me. Or for me. It was a horrible feeling, like my mind was being invaded. I closed my eyes, just for a few seconds, trying to erase it. When I opened, the road had changed. It was still the same, technically, but now the sky was darker, more gray. The trees were twisted, they looked dead. And the branch, the same broken branch, was now in the middle of the track. Stopped, like a signal. I knew, without any logical explanation, that if I walked past him one more time, I wouldn't come back. I can't say where I would go, but it was as if that point was the border. The end of the line. Or perhaps the beginning of something even worse. But then, out of nowhere, everything stopped. The truck turned off on its own. The radio went silent. The silence was absolute. I blinked and, when I realized, I was on a familiar road, about 30 kilometers from where it all started. The truck worked normally, the sky was already blue, full of ordinary clouds. It seemed like nothing had happened. But I knew I had it. I never took that route again. I never drove during dawn again. And to this day, when I pass any very deserted road, I hope to see that branch again. That curve that leads nowhere. As if the road was still there, waiting for me to return. I usually say that I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing compares to what I experienced that morning. It was around 3 in the morning when I stopped at one of those truck stops in the middle of nowhere, between one state and another. I was tired, had a bad back, and just wanted a strong coffee and a few minutes out of the cabin. The stop was practically empty, just a truck pulled up to the side, with the engine off and the lights off. I went into the small cafe in the corner, ordered my coffee and went to sit at one of the tables near the window. That's when I saw the guy. He was already there when I entered, sitting in the shadows, wearing a worn-out cap and a dirty jacket. It seemed to have come from an ancient time. He looked up when I sat down, but didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me for a few seconds, as if he was trying to remember me. I thought it was some old acquaintance, but his face was completely strange. There was something in his eyes that bothered me. It wasn't madness, nor aggression, it was as if he knew too much. When he finally spoke, he was direct, taking the route north, right? I hadn't spoken to anyone about it, nor was there anything in my truck to indicate the destination. I froze instantly. I asked him how he knew, trying to keep the tone casual, and he only replied, "I took that same trip, many years ago." I thought it was talk about a lonely truck driver, one of those people who like to make small talk just to pass the time. But there was something about the way he spoke, slow, precise, as if every word had been rehearsed. He started telling me about the route. He talked about specific sections, about an abandoned gas station that I was still going to pass, about a viaduct that seemed to collapse every time I passed under it. Things I had never seen, but for some reason, sounded familiar. As if they were at the edge of my memory, about to happen. The strangest thing is that he spoke in the past tense, as if he had already experienced it. But the road he described was the same one I would take in a few hours. Little by little, he became darker. He said that at a certain point in the trip, my radio would start to fail. That I would hear a voice calling my name, but it wasn't anyone I knew. He talked about a left turn where a car turns on its headlights on the shoulder but never passes. And after that, he said that time would start to behave differently. That the hands of the clock would turn, but the sky would remain the same. He said everything with such certainty that I started to sweat. I couldn't take my eyes off him. It was as if he was describing a ready-made script. A script of mine. And everything in me screamed that this was no coincidence. I tried to ask who he really was. He just replied, "You'll understand when you get there." And that's when everything got even weirder. He described a moment when I was supposedly stopping at the side of the road because of a strange noise coming from the engine, something that seemed urgent, but wasn't mechanical at all. He said I was going to get out, look at the engine, and when I looked back up at the road, the world around me would be different. "It won't be the same place," he said, his voice firm. "It looks the same, but it's not. You'll feel it. The smell changes. The silence changes. And then, either you keep going, or you don't come back." The worst thing about it was that the more he talked, the more it all made sense in my head, as if I was already being remembered instead of being learned. I didn't know if I was being suggested or if there was something wrong with me, but I started to feel dizzy. The diner was empty besides the two of us, and the air felt increasingly heavy. I looked around to see if anyone else had come in, any employees, anything, but nothing. It felt like the world had shrunk around that conversation. As if only the two of us were existing at that moment. And every detail he described about my trip seemed inevitable. As if it were no longer a choice. When I mentioned that I could simply change route, go back, and never go again, he just shook his head, with a tired half-smile. "It's no use. It's already started." It was that sentence that gave me chills. "What do you mean, has it already started?" I hadn't even gotten into the truck again yet. But he seemed convinced that just by standing there, just by being in that conversation, I had already crossed some invisible line. As if I was already caught up in what he was telling me, I just didn't know it yet. I tried to get up, but my legs felt heavy, and my head was throbbing. He continued speaking, now in a lower tone, as if he were giving instructions. "When you see the woman in the blue dress on the side of the road, don't stop. It doesn't matter if she asks for help." That froze me inside. The way he said it, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. He talked about more things, small details, a truck without license plates that appears in the rearview mirror, a strong smell of rust out of nowhere, interference on the radio that always repeats the same number. Everything so specific, so vivid. And then, out of nowhere, he stopped talking. He just looked at me for a few seconds and said, "I won't remember you. But you will remember me." I got up on impulse, with my heart racing. I went straight to the cashier, but there was no one there. The light in the diner seemed dimmer than before, as if the place had aged 20 years while we were talking. I looked at the table where he was, empty. I didn't hear him get up, I didn't see the door open. He just wasn't there anymore. I went outside in a hurry, trying to see if his truck was still there, and swear by everything, there was nothing. Just mine. No headlights on, no engine noise, no dust in the air. It was as if he had never existed. I got into my truck without knowing what to do. Still shaking, I started the engine, buckled up and stood there, looking at the steering wheel for a few minutes. I tried to convince myself that it was just a weird conversation with a crazy person, a coincidence, maybe even a daydream. But the fear did not go away. I got on the road again, it was still dawn, and everything seemed normal at first. But then the radio failed. There was a strong static, then silence. And soon after, a weak voice, repeating my name. It wasn't a voice I recognized. And at the same time, I remembered his words. It was exactly what he had said would happen. Time was getting weird. The sky was clearing, but the sun wasn't coming. I passed sections that seemed to be duplicates. The same viaduct, the same curve, the same post, again and again. And then, like a script I already knew, I saw her. The woman in the blue dress. On the side of the road, on the left side, standing, looking straight at me. The pale face, neutral expression. She raised her hand slowly, like a hitchhiker. I crashed. I wanted to brake, I wanted to stop, but his words came hard to my mind. Don't stop. I kept my foot firmly on the accelerator. When I passed her, I looked in the rearview mirror. She wasn't there anymore. I never found out who that guy was. I've never been able to explain what happened on that trip. But everything he told me, everything, happened. As if he had lived before for me. As if I were myself, in some way I don't understand. To this day, I avoid that route. And every time I stop at a truck stop, I look twice before sitting down at any table. Because if I see him again, whoever he is, I think next time it won't just be a warning. It will be the end of the line. This happened on one of the strangest mornings I've ever faced on the road. It was winter, and the temperature was close to freezing. The fog was as thick as milk, and even with my high beams on, I could barely see 10 meters ahead. I had left a distribution center in the interior of Minas, around 2 in the morning, heading south. Nothing new, nothing out of the ordinary, until I noticed him. It was just a silhouette at first. He was standing on the other side of the road, on the edge of the road, half hidden by the fog. A thin, motionless figure, almost glued to the bushes. I only saw it because my eyes fell there by chance. I thought it was strange, but I moved on. It didn't take long for me to see him again. But now, further on. He was standing in the same way, now on the right side of the road, a good few meters from the shoulder. I couldn't see his face or clothes clearly. It was just that dark, tall silhouette, always still. I thought it was a coincidence, that it was another guy, maybe walking around. But over time, the frequency with which I saw that figure increased. Sometimes I only noticed him in my peripheral vision, as if he were lurking between the trees. Other times, it appeared in the open field. Always at the same distance, as if there was an invisible line that he never crossed. I tried to speed up. I ignored it. I kept repeating to myself that it was tiredness, that my brain was playing tricks because of the fog and sleep. But it wasn't that. I knew. At every curve, every straight line, he was there. He never ran, never made sudden movements, he just appeared. As if he was sure I would see him, and that was enough. The most disturbing part is that it never completely disappeared, it just slowly disappeared into the mist, as if it were made of it. I began to feel a strange tension in the air, as if the silence on the road had grown heavier. The truck seemed slower, more rooted to the ground. After a while, I stopped at a rest area to try to breathe and clear my head. I left the cabin, lit a cigarette and stood outside, trying to see if anyone was there. I was completely alone. Nothing but the dim light of the streetlights and the dense fog. But then I saw him again, at the end of the rest area, standing there, staring at me. At that point, I no longer had any doubts. It was the same man. Same size, same distance. But something had changed. Even from afar, I felt that he now knew that I had noticed. It wasn't about scaring me or following me anymore, it was like he was waiting for me. I stood still for a few seconds, staring back at him, trying to understand if it was real or if my mind had slipped for good. But the more I looked, the clearer it seemed. It was still a shadow, but now I could make out details that weren't there before. The outline of what looked like a hat, something like a long coat blowing in the wind, but the wind had stopped. The air was completely still, as if the surrounding time had frozen. The cigarette tip burned all the way to the filter and I didn't even feel it. I threw it away, got back in the truck and got out of there as quickly as I could. I thought that by speeding up I would get away from that. But the feeling got worse. It was as if the road was stretching, getting longer with every kilometer. Landmarks are gone. Signs, entrances, intersections, everything disappeared. There was only that track, straight, covered in fog, and my truck sliding on the asphalt. And him. Always there. From the corner of my eye, on the side of the road, sometimes a little ahead, sometimes behind, visible in the rearview mirror. The most bizarre thing is that, even without a face, I knew he was looking at me. Not with hate. Not in a hurry. But with a cruel kind of patience, as if he knew that, sooner or later, I would stop. And I stopped. Not because I wanted to, but because the truck turned off on its own. It simply went out in the middle of the track. All systems working perfectly seconds before. The engine stopped, the dashboard died, even the headlights went out. I was in the dark for a few seconds that seemed like hours. The only sound was my own breathing, heavy, irregular. When I looked out the window, there he was again. Now in the middle of the road, facing the truck, as if it was waiting for me to get off. The distance was the same, but this time it seemed closer. Not in space, but in intention. As if something was about to change. I remained inside, motionless, with my hands glued to the steering wheel. I didn't even try to start the engine again. Something told me there was no point. Time didn't pass. The clock had stopped at 4:17, and stayed that way for almost half an hour. The fog outside began to slowly rotate, as if something was stirring it, breathing within it. I don't know how to explain it better than that, but it was as if the air around was alive, conscious. And he was still there. Always at the same distance. Always looking. Until, out of nowhere, the engine started by itself. The lights came back on. The radio chirped a meaningless frequency. And I did the only thing I could, I accelerated with all my might. I drove for hours, or so it seemed. But the scariest thing is that the road remained the same. No changes in the landscape, no different curves, no intersections. Just the tracks on the ground and the darkness around, as if I were stuck on a single stretch of road repeating itself infinitely. And yet, there he was. Always accompanying me. Always stopped. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the figure appearing, on the left side, then on the right, then a little further ahead. He never moved, never took a step. It just appeared. It was as if he wasn't walking, as if he was part of the road. In a moment of pure desperation, I stopped the truck in the middle of the road and got out, determined to face it. I screamed. I cursed. I told him to appear at once. But silence responded in his place. And then he appeared, but not in the way I expected. He was on both sides of the road at the same time. It was like looking into a broken mirror, several versions of the same shadow, all standing still, all looking at me from where they were. There was no logic. It didn't make sense. I closed my eyes, covered my ears, tried to erase it from my mind. And when I opened my eyes again, everything disappeared. The shadows, the fog, even the cold. The road seemed normal again. The clock had started to tick again. The sky was starting to lighten. I managed to start the truck and continue traveling. Everything seemed to be back to normal, signs reappeared, I saw a distant gas station, I heard a radio signal. But something inside me said it wasn't over. That it had only receded for a while. Since then, I've never seen the Shadow Man again, but I've never been able to drive at night in peace again. I always look at the corners of the road, even when I know there's nothing there. Because that's the problem, he's never close. He is always, at a distance. There are nights when I wake up with a start, with that feeling that I'm being watched. And there are times when, even inside the house, I swear I see that silhouette standing in the backyard. It never moves. Never approaches. Just wait. And I know that one day, on some forgotten road, I will see him again, the same way. From the same place. As if he never left. And when that happens, I don't know if I'll be able to escape again.